In today's episode of Flashlights 101, we're talking about the most basic terms that you'll hear in the enthusiast flashlight community, like throwers and flutters, different beam characteristic terms like hotspot, corona, spill. We'll talk about some optic types like reflectors, tiers, or TIRs, and Mule. We'll also even get into, just for a little bit, the different kind of characteristics you're looking for in emitters, whether you want a thrower, a flutter, or maybe an EDC, an everyday carry light. So let's take a look at some of the lights that we have in front of us here. These flashlights I have in front of me have been sorted out roughly by optic types. These are reflectors. These are TIRs or tiers. These two are actually LEPs, and this one over here is a Mule. So let's start with the idea of throwers and flutters. So in the most basic terms, flutters are lights that take their light and spread it out, and throwers tend to cast the light really far. So let's take a look at a thrower versus a flutter right away. So this light right here, this is called an Octagon K1, and this is a classic thrower, and it has a smooth reflector. So you can see here that the optic is just an aluminized surface. There's a little emitter down in the bottom there, and it's trying to concentrate all the light to go as far as possible. So if I turn that guy on, you can see that it's very, very concentrated. We have a hot spot right here, and then this area around here is called the spill. Now, this hot spot is very intense, and the spill is very light, and there's actually not a lot of something that I also call a corona. The corona is going to be a kind of a lesser area that's brighter than the spill, but lesser than the hot spot, which is right around it. Now, I see some concentric circles, some artifacts, and all beams have artifacts unless they're really, really smooth and floody, which we'll get to that in a second. But for the most part, the light, I would consider it to be all hot spot and spill. Now, let's take a look at a similar light by the same company, and this one is just a lot smaller, and this is sometimes called a pocket thrower, and you can see that it has a smooth reflector just like before, actually a very similar emitter. It's by Osram. It's a very similar emitter to the one we just saw, but it's just in a smaller light. Now, because this reflector is tinier and the emitter is about the same size, expect a wider beam, because the bigger the reflector, the more it's going to be concentrated. So this will be more spread out because the reflector is actually tinier. So let's take a look here. Let me just pull it down a little bit for exposure. And you can see that the beam is not quite as intense, not quite as concentrated, but you can also see that there's definitely a hot spot, and then there's this corona emerging that I was talking about, and the spill is way out here. It's very light, but it's out here. Let me turn the light up a little bit, and you can see more this spill, and then in the middle, let's turn it down, you can see the hot spot and then this fuzzy corona. So that term corona I see occasionally in the forums, but definitely make note of the hot spot and then on the outside here, the spill. Okay. Now, all reflectors have this spill. Let me grab another light. This is a really big light, and this one has a deep reflector as well, and it's also a smooth reflector, meaning that it's just completely mirrored and smooth. We'll get into some light orange peel in a moment, but when I turn it on, let's try and make it a little lower if I can. There we go. You can see that the hot spot's bigger than the last two, and then the spill's out here, and there's a little bit of corona. And the reason why the hot spot's bigger, even though the reflector is about the same as the K1 here. Let's put them side by side for comparison. The reason that this one is more spread out is because, oops, I'm failing at operating my lights here. Let me turn it off. Is because when you look at the emitters, take a look at the fact that the emitter at the bottom of this one is a very, very tiny little Osram emitter, and the emitter at the bottom of this one, you can see, is a larger luminous emitter. It's called SPT 90.2. And so what we've got here is we've got a situation where even though the reflectors are around the same size, the actual dye that's emitting the light is spread out at the source. So if you want maximum throw, you want a lot of intensity, a lot of candela. Candela is the rating by how far light goes in a ray. You want the absolute smallest emitter you can get with the biggest reflector. So if I were to take, for example, this guy here, which again has one of those small little tiny Osram emitters, and it's got a smaller reflector, as we said, it spreads out a little bit, right? So there we go. So here's on the right, the smaller one. Here's on the left, the bigger reflector, but it's pretty much the same emitter. And you can see what it does to the candela, meaning that the fact that it's more spread out over here, it will not go as far. This one would project the light much further than this one would. But now let's look at a different kind of combo. Let's look at the fact that this one with the SBT 90.2 I was talking about, what if I put that emitter, which is a much larger emitter, in a little tiny body like this guy? So let me turn around and grab it. Okay, here we go. So here we go. So this is the same body, same reflector, but if you look inside it there, you can see that there is that SBT 90.2 that we saw in the big black light. So let's take a look at comparison. Okay. Oops, I'm blocking the camera. There we go. Let me just equalize this out a little bit. There we go. You can see how there's a much bigger hot spot and a considerably more corona on the one on the right. So again, it's kind of a balancing act between the size of the emitter and the size of the reflector. Now, if I take this same, here we go. So we take the same emitter here and put it into a really large reflector like this. All right, let's see here. There we go. You can see that the larger reflector has it more concentrated and less corona and less spill. So they're still there, but it's just less of it on the outsides, which means that this one will be more intense at the highest intensity, at the highest outputs, and therefore it will throw much farther than this one will. All right, now, I didn't do this before. You might find this interesting. Let's take that Osram light here. Whoops, let's get it lower. There we go. Okay, so here we go. Let's get this as low as possible. Let's see if I can just get that more obvious. So it's just too hard to tell on camera. There's a little tiny square in the middle there, whereas this one, the square is much wider. All right, so we just knocked off a bunch of these lights. We talked about all these guys here. Now, what do we got over here? All right, so now this is a reflector as well, but this one has a light orange peel to it. If you look, there's kind of a crinkle pattern, and the whole point of a light orange peel like that is to kind of spread out, kind of even out the beam. So let's take a look at this light in action. You can see that it's still pretty throwy for what it is, but do you see how it's kind of more soft? It just kind of just blobs out. That's the feature of the light orange peel and how the light orange peel interacts with the concentration of the rays here. Now, because it's a reflector, this guy still is kind of throwy. It's still pretty kind of, concentrated in the middle here. And then you can see that there is a spill around the sides. Okay, now let's take a look at this guy. This is a very, very tiny, tiny, tiny little reflector here. Okay, and because it's so tiny, you're going to see that it's kind of let's see if I can get this there we go. It's kind of a soft beam that just kind of fades out. Now there's definitely a spill still. You can see the spill, but it's much softer. So the size of reflector totally matters. And lastly, let's take a look at this guy. Now this guy is really interesting because even though it has a reflector, it's got multi-emitters, and these emitters are quite large, and they're domed. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but these have a dome on them, which actually spreads out the light even more. So these are called SBT 70.2s. They actually happen to be 4 emitters per die. So you're looking at 8 times 4 here. This is a lot of emitters. But this will be floody. And you can see, let's see if I can, there we go. You can see that it's kind of soft and kind of floody. This one, if I kind of tilt the light here, you can see it decreases towards the edges. And this light gives 130 degrees of light, and I'm on the lowest setting right now. I mean, it gets quite bright. Here, I'll just hit, yeah, you can see when I put on high, you can't even tell what's going on here. This is called an Ace-Beam X50. It's definitely a flutter, and it's just meant to put out as much light as possible, but not necessarily very far. So again, this one on the left, the Convoy L7, is about 4,000 or 5,000 lumens, and this one on the right can do 40,000 lumens, but lumens isn't everything, because the candela is so much greater on the L7 that this one can pick things off a mile away, no problem. Whereas this one, 600 meters maybe. So, you know, but if I want to light up a whole field, I'm going to use this guy. This is for picking off like small targets really far away. So again, thrower and flutter. Okay. Now, that is the end of looking at the reflectors. We just looked at all these guys, and all these had reflectors, okay? Now we're going to look at tier optics. These guys right in the middle here, these are all tiers. Now, let me look at a very simple tier first so that makes sense to you. What a tier is it's a plastic or acrylic optic that's behind the glass, and it's basically acting like a fiber optic. It's a total internal reflection, TIR or tier. And what it does is the light that's emitted bounces around and then comes out in a kind of like a fiber optic would, kind of like a straight direction. So this is a different way to get light to focus instead of using a reflective surface. And I mean, it is reflective, I guess. It's internally reflective. But it has an interesting look to it, and there's one emitter in here. And this one emitter happens to be kind of a similar emitter to what's in here. This is SBT 70.2, and this is also a single SBT 70.2 at the bottom. It's called an Ace-Beam L35. Let's take a look at what it looks like on the wall. This is definitely a thrower. I mean, look at this large tier. That could kind of give you a clue that's going to be a thrower. You can see it's concentrated. Now, what's great about a tier is it has a hot spot here, and then kind of like a corona that fades out into the spill. And at the edge of the spill, it kind of just is a gradient that just fades off into nothingness. There's no hard edge on the spill. So if I take a look at this tier on the right and kind of compare it against your traditional reflector, on the reflector, you're going to see this hard-edged spill, and the spill is very even, meaning that if I measure this amount of lumens right here versus here, it's all the same through, and then a very intense hot spot. Whereas with the tier, it has, you know, a hot spot in the middle that even kind of decreases a little bit as it gets to here, and then there's maybe a little corona here, would say, and you can see the corona's brighter in the center, and then it tapers out, and then the spill tapers all the way out to where there's nothing. So it's definitely a different look. I tend to really like large tiers like this. I think they look amazing. And not to say that there's anything wrong with a traditional reflector, but the tiers definitely smooth out a lot of the artifacts that you're seeing with reflectors. Now, let it also be said that at the ranges you're supposed to use these things at, which is like hundreds of meters, these little artifacts don't show up. I mean, we're white wall hunting here at about 5 feet away, so this is showing every little artifact. So I wouldn't concern yourself with these little guys. They're just not there at anything past about 10, 20 meters. But these tiers look really neat. They're just a different way to go. I find that if you take the same exact emitter, which these are not, but if you take the same exact emitter and put it in a reflector, the reflector is slightly more intense than the tier. The tier is a little less efficient, but just the way it looks really appeals to me. I also have another tier right here. This one's a little larger. So here is the L35 on the right, and on the left here is an L19. It happens to be green. And I want to show you that the tiers are a little bit different shape and size. They're pretty close. They're not that different. But the interesting thing here is that this emitter is physically larger, and this emitter is a little tiny Osram, one of those little tiny square emitters like we saw before. And so, again, slightly larger optic, smaller emitter, this is going to be more candela, more throw. Oops, let me do it on low here. There we go. So you can see that the emitter is much more concentrated here on the left. Now, don't worry about the brightness on camera because none of this is really calibrated. Just look at the size of it. You can see how, here, let me see if I can get this really low. Hang on. Okay, that's too low. All right, let's go a little higher. That's what I'm going to have to deal with. Okay, so there's a little hot spot here. And again, as I said, there's a corona that kind of fades out and then some spill that we're not really seeing. Maybe if I go to, if I go to turbo, you can start seeing some spill. But again, it's really smooth. And these are tiers. Now, another popular thing to do is to put multiple emitters with tiers in an EDC light. So EDC means everyday carry. You can see these are really tiny. They fit your front pocket, and you kind of barely know you have them. This one, if you take a look, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's quad tiers. This is a Carcolo optic. It's a 10-622 that Hank sells on International Outdoor. And this is going to have a really, really smooth look to it because there's 4 emitters and the tiers are kind of tiny. Let's see what I got here. Let's see if I can get this guy. There we go. So you can see there's just kind of, it's a little bit throwy. It's not flooding the whole scene like that big X50 I had, but this is definitely a flutter light. This is not a thrower per se. And you can see that it's kind of smooth and it kind of moves out to the edge. Now I have this one, which is basically the same optic. I just wanted to show you one difference about this small little quad tier. And that is that this one is frosted. So this is called a Carcolo 10-623. And the frosting makes it even floodier. So while this one kind of has a little spot right here, this one, you can see it's softer. It's a little more spread out. Now, let me go to a low ramp on both of these. I'm going to try and approximate. This is going to be my best guess. Notice how the one on the left looks more intense and the one on the right is, let me get it like that. There we go. It's less intense, but it's more spread out. That's what you probably could expect if you had the exact same emitters, same driver, same everything, but you went with a 1062 and a 1063. So when you look at these guys, and it's got the clear tier optic, and this one has the frosted tier optic. Don't worry about this blue. Those are just auxiliary lights. These are fancy lights. This has auxiliaries too, but these are on high. These are on low. This isn't frosted. This is frosted. There's some differences going on here. But I just want to point out that the frosted side here will look less intense and more spread out. Kind of like if you took, silly putty and pushed it over a picture and then spread the silly putty out. You know how it gets like less intense and more diffuse? That's what's going on. Now, the reason this one has that kind of frosted diffuse tier is if you look, you can see that, let's get it like, okay, that's about as low as I can do here. Yeah, you can see though. If you look, you can see that there is 2 warmer emitters and 2 cooler emitters in this one. Whereas this one over here, let me make it low, this one was just all the same temperature. So if you're going to go SST20s, which is what this emitter is, they don't tend to have too many artifacts, and this is all the same color, so you might as well go with the more throwy, clear optic. But on this one, these are E21As, and they tend to have tons of little artifacts that project on the wall when you use a clear throwy tier. And in fact, this thing is mixed color temperature, so it's just best to kind of hit it with a frosted optic to kind of smooth everything out. One of the reasons, and if you want to know more about tint and why we would mix, you should check out my other video called Tint Talk. And in that, we run down what it does to the tint and the color temperature when you mix different color CCTs or color temperatures of emitters. So if you want to know more about the terms like tint or CCT or BBL or DUV or bins, definitely go take a look at that video. That video is quite long and involved on that. Okay, so we just polished off tiers. All right, so there we go. We did all these guys. We just did those. Now let's talk about the LEPs, these two things right here. Now, LEPs are not LEDs, right? These are all light-emitting diodes. These are LEPs, which is light-emitting phosphor. I'm sorry, light-excited phosphor. I made the classic mistake that I see on the forums a lot. A lot of people say light-emitting. They're probably just thinking of LEDs, which are light-emitting diodes. But these aren't emitting at all. These are light-excited phosphors. There's a blue laser, and I mean it's quite blue, it's housed in these lights, and the laser hits a series of mirrors and obstructions that then hit a phosphor layer, and the layer of phosphor illuminates and turns white. So these are mechanically similar. They're just different sizes, different amounts of phosphor, and different types of concave lenses there. Or sorry, convex lenses. So this one right here, I have it on low. The reason why, nobody starting out in flashlights should probably own an LEP. They're very expensive and they have limited use. And part of the reason they have limited use is if you look, it's all hotspot. There's basically no corona and there's no spill. Now, that's not to say that there's absolutely no spill. I mean, at the highest level of scrutiny, if you make it on high here, you start to see a little bit of artifacts. And in here with the lights on, I really don't see the spill. But on this one, and by the way, there's a filter on here. I could go white or I'll go yellow. I'll go yellow just so that you can tell which one I got on my hands here. Let me go higher. Okay, there you go. On the highest, you can see this kind of ring right here. See that ring? Now, trust me, at night, you can notice it, but it's not spill. I would not consider this spill. It's more of just an artifact from the internal reflections of this body here. And not all LEPs have it. For example, the one that I was just playing with, this one, doesn't seem to really have that even on a high. I'm moving it around. I don't really see it. I think at night when my eyes are dark adapted, I did notice. But anyways, just let's suffice to say that LEPs are all hotspot, no corona, no spill. Now, that's kind of fun the first time you use them because you could be in an urban setting, throw some light right where you want it. It almost feels like a laser. Just lasers are completely directional light, and these are directional as well. They're very intense, tons of candela. They go very far. But let's talk about spill for a second here. While people tend to think spill is a bad idea because you're putting light places where you don't want it, the fact of the matter is it's actually quite useful. So let's take a look at this LEP I have here on the right, and let's take a look at this traditional thrower here with the reflector. And you'll notice that this one has spill, right? You can see it here. I'll point with my fingers. There's some spill, and this one does not, right? Here's the thing about that. You're walking around at night, you're looking for something. So this intense hot spot in the center, you're going to put that on what you're looking for. And the spill is going to aid you in knowing your surroundings and walking around and finding your footing on the ground. Because we're assuming you're like in a field or where there's no street lighting. So this actually turns out to be super useful. It's much lower. It doesn't ruin your dark adaptation because like things that are very close to you, like the ground, aren't reflecting a ton of light back on you. This guy, I mean, it's hard to walk around with it because you're shining this maybe 100, 200, 500 meters away, and there's just not a lot of light in front of you to walk around by. So if you're standing still, LEPs are pretty cool. I find a lot of people that are in urban environments like these because they're not annoying their neighbors and they're not really walking around. But when you start walking around or hiking or something like that and you're looking for something far away, I think that a light like this with a little spill is really advantageous. Do you remember that the large tiers, like this one, is a large tier, also does have a spill? It's just a different type of spill. So you could still walk around by this. Now, let's talk about my last kind of light here. Let me tilt down. And the last kind of light is the Mule. Okay? Now, this guy, a Mule is basically just an industry term for having no optic at all. So you can see that there's 16 square emitters on a PCB here, and there's no, luminized reflector, there's no tiers, no nothing. In fact, if I took these quad emitters here, and I unscrewed the bezel and removed the optic, you would find 4 little emitters like this under here. So technically you could take one of these quad emitters and just disassemble it, remove the optic, and then put this back on and essentially have a Mule. So why would you buy a Mule from, a manufacturer? For one thing, if they don't have to line it up for actual optics, they can shove more of them on there, and you can see that I got 16 as opposed to 4. Also, they can move this PCB closer to the bezel so that you get more spread. You get a wider beam. The PCB is a little lower in here, and it still works, but you get more of a cone shape because it's being occluded by this bezel. Now, let's talk about this, what this looks like. So this is going to be a completely flat, artifact-free beam. All right, so let's turn it on here. There you go. You can see it. Let me lock the exposure. You can see it's completely flat. Maybe it's slightly more intense in the middle than on the outsides, but I mean, that's just slightly. And the camera's picking up better than my eyes do. My eyes just see the walls lit up evenly. So let me go a little lower. You can see how even it is. As I move the beam around, you can kind of see that it is a circle, but I mean, this is a very, very even beam. Now let me go really bright with it, and you can see that it gets quite bright. I mean, as a point of comparison, with this on, let's hit the wall with this one next to it. Okay, I'm going to hit this traditional tier here. Hang on one second. I am failing at getting this thing on. It auto-locked out. There we go. All right, so here's where I was before, and this isn't the highest it can go, but let's just stay there and then hit this guy on, and you can see that it pretty much washes it out. Now, it is more candela over here, so if I double-click to turbo, well, that's blooming. What you just saw on the camera, that's the CCD not being able to take the incoming light, so it doesn't really look like that. That was a bad example. I won't go back to it. Now, one thing I want to talk about mules. If you're doing photography, these are awesome. You want even light. Traditional flashlights that we're seeing down here, they just have too much intensity in a hot spot, and they look bad on your subject in most cases. Mules are great for kind of portable photography lighting. They're also really good in a house when you're walking around in small spaces, like a 10 by 10, 20 by 20 room, but they have tons of fall off. There's just no intensity, no candela here. And so the light, even though there's a ton of lumens, this thing puts out about 3,000 lumens. The fact of the matter is it just doesn't go very far. I would say that even though this is 3,000 lumens, I can only light up maybe 50 feet away reasonably, whereas this guy is like 300 lumens, so it's 1/10 as many lumens, but it's all candela, right? This is that LEP, so you can see how intense it is. This guy can go a mile easily, so there's a difference there. So thrower, flutter, right? Last light that I don't even have a copy of because I hate them, but I'll talk about it, is Zoomies, Zoom lights. Now, the reason why I think Zoom lights are terrible is because one thing, they're trying to do the best of all worlds, right? You just move the optic up and down, and you get supposedly a thrower or a flutter. Here's why I don't like them. At their fullest extent, and you're trying to make it a thrower, you actually focus it because there's going to be a lens in front, and the beam isn't a round hotspot. It looks like the emitter chip itself. You're going to get a square chip shape that you're throwing, a couple hundred meters. So first off, I find that objectionable. I just don't like the look of it. But secondly, and this is really the big deal, is you pull it down, you make it a flutter, and it looks like this Mule. Now, I just said that mules were good for things. Yeah, but you're talking about not a dedicated light. You're not talking about a photography light. You're talking about something you bought off Amazon that's a Zoomie, and you're trying to use it for a lot of variety of purposes. Well, when you're walking around outside, think about the fact that I just said that in its flood configuration, this thing doesn't throw very far, right? So you make it a little floody, but notice how even the beam is? What that means is when you're walking around, the ground in front of you is lit up very intense, or at least as intense as what you're trying to see. And so your eyes just you lose dark adaptation. Your pupils constrict and it's too bright. So then you decrease, the beam strength so that your eyes can take it, and then the center decreases as well, and you can't see anything. So you start to see the wisdom in a traditional thrower, which has a high intense spotlight and then some very kind of low intensity spill. This is not actually a bad thing. I know that when I first got into flashlights, I thought this was like an artifact or some problem. No, this helps you walk around and see things with a thrower. This is actually really ideal. So just to recap, LEPs, they're neat. They don't have any spill. If you're not walking around, I find them okay. Mules are all spill, right? This is just basically 100% spill. This is really bad for seeing things far away. Good for walking around. If you want to walk around and see what's in front of you, they're nice. But I still just don't think this is great for outside in general. To me, it's photography and inside only. All right. Hope that was useful. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this video. And again, if you want to know more about emitters now, because I didn't talk a lot about emitters, I'll just kind of sum up here and say that the smaller the emitter, so you can see that this emitter is a little tiny yellow emitter with a dome, where these emitters are big with domes. The smaller the emitter and the more lumens it puts out per millimeter of emitter, the more throw the light's going to have. Okay, so there's kind of this interesting thing where if you take a look at these two lights, for example, this one on the right is an Osram W1. It is about 900 lumens, but the phosphor area is about 1 millimeter squared. This guy, the SPT 90.2, is about 5,000 lumens, so much brighter, but the phosphor area is much bigger. So what I find is between these two lights, this one, even though it's less lumens, throws further. But as we saw against the wall, smaller hotspot. So its intensity is higher, but so in the hotspot, the lumens, per square inch is brighter, even though the total lumens is less. This one's just more spread out. Now, between these two lights, I find this light much more useful. Cheaper too. Convoy, what an economical brand. So this Convoy L7 is an amazing light. But every light has its use, right? So again, I'm going to point you to the fact that I'm going to stop talking about emitters. If you want to know more about tint, CCT, BBL, DUV, and bins, you should check out my Tint Talk video. And with that, peace.